Good afternoon. I'm Nadine Hani. I present the business news on Al Arabiya News Channel. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the Outlook on the Global Agenda 2015 panel discussion. As the theme of this session indicates, we will try over the next hour to discuss some of the most important global issues of our time. In its Outlook on the Global Agenda, the World Economic Forum brought together experts who are renowned not only for their thought leadership, but also for their commitment to find solutions that will improve the state of the world. Their aim was to identify the top trends that will shape the world in 2015 and the key challenges that face the world's regions. The findings of the 2015 Global Outlook publication were different from previous years. At a time when global concerns about the financial crisis seem to have subsided, the participants identified worsening income inequality as the top trend shaping the world in 2015. The divide between rich and poor became part of a widespread public debate following the publication this year of Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century, where he argued that capitalism may permit the wealthy to pull ahead of the rest of society at ever faster rates. Bloomberg recently published a feature article debating whether quantitative easing exacerbated the divide between rich and poor at a time when monetary policy spurred growth but failed to create the needed jobs. Hence, the heightened risk of jobless recovery, another trend on the outlook for this year. As a result, we are seeing a backlash against globalization and a retreat to nationalism, which takes us to the political landscape, where the rise of extremism, as seen in events across the Middle East this year, constitutes one of the major regional challenges for our part of the world. Exacerbating this challenge is a lack of global leadership. Instead of innovating and collaborating to tackle societal and economic challenges, nations and leaders are retreating into isolationism. Of course, 75 minutes are not enough to cover those topics, but we will try as much as possible. I have with me a panel of experts. Please join me in welcoming them. I will introduce them in the order in which they are seated. Next to me is Mr. Kevin Rudd, Senior Fellow at the Belfer Center on International Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School and twice Prime Minister of Australia previously. Ms. Amina Mohammed is Assistant Secretary General and Special Advisor on Post-2015 Development Planning at the UN. Dr. Rula Deshti is Chairman at Faro International, and she was Minister of State Planning and Development Affairs in Kuwait and the first female Member of Parliament in Kuwait. Mr. Majid Jafar is the CEO of Crescent Petroleum here in the UAE. And Dr. Adam Posen is president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics from the USA. So thank you very much for joining us today. Mr. Rudd, I would like to start with you. As we said, the Outlook outlined very important trends that will shape the agenda of policymakers in 2015. But when you are a contributor to the Outlook, but when you look at the list of topics like that, which do you think worries you the most, and which do you think should be at the top of the agenda of policymakers for 2015?
Well, firstly, I think it's a very good thing that the World Economic Forum goes through this annual exercise. Most people engaged in public policy around the world do not have time to think. Therefore, a disciplined exercise to look beyond the radar and to look beyond the horizon is very important. So contributions like this, I think, are useful as a foundation point for the global discourse because there is inadequate planning nationally, globally, on the challenges that we face. In terms of the vast spectrum of challenges that we face in the decade ahead, and the World Economic Forum has produced 10 of them. I take a very simple premise, is that politics matters, and it can either be an enormous problem solver or a massive problem producer, and that is either politics nationally or internationally. So when I look at the unfolding challenges of the year ahead, look first and foremost at what are the extraordinary new phenomenon in geopolitics, which we now face. Of course, politics and geopolitics, if it goes wrong, can undermine everything else. And parallel to that, if I was identifying a second one, it's handmade in this exercise is the rise of nationalism. So let me speak just for a little bit about those two thoughts. And I'm sure colleagues here will have different perspectives given their different professional prisms. On geopolitics, if you stand back and look at what has unfolded in the last year or so, we are looking at such a radically new geopolitical landscape compared with anything we thought was possible even 5 years ago, even really 3 years ago. I think we'd reached a conclusion that in our hearts and in our minds that the days of aggressive geopolitics lay with a previous century and not with the 21st century. Yet now what we have is massive challenges across the world, and we know the principal zones of engagement. We see the huge geopolitical challenges across the Middle East, across a number of states, and the potential fragmentation of states within this wider region. Secondly, we see the enormous new geostrategic tensions arising between Russia on the one hand and the European Union, the United States, and other countries on the other, on the question intrinsically of the Ukraine, but more broadly as well. And here we are, 25 years after the Berlin Wall came down, and we are looking at Mikhail Gorbachev warning us yesterday, literally, of the return of a second Cold War. And then thirdly, just lurking beneath the horizon in the hemisphere that I come from, which is Asia and the Pacific, in our hemisphere we have a collection of 21st century globalizing economies sitting on the top of a bunch of 19th century geopolitical and nationalist realities where territorial tensions remain as acute as we've ever seen them. And so when you put those three things together, we are faced with a radical new geopolitical landscape. And let me just elucidate a little further on the question of Asia and the Pacific, because often it's not as acutely visible either in this part of the world or more broadly in Europe or in the Americas. When we see the rise of China, something I've been engaged in for 30, 35 years as a politician, a diplomat, a businessman, this is a earth-moving event. It's changing the tectonic plates in the sense that depending on how it's counted, if you accept the calculations on purchasing parity pricing, or you accept market exchange rates calculations of gross domestic product, somewhere within the next decade, possibly this year, possibly a decade's time, China will be the largest economy in the world. And therefore, when we think of what that will mean in terms for the first time in a couple of hundred years, for a non-Western, non-democratic, non-English-speaking state to be the largest economy in the world, frankly, everything that people have assumed as being the normal state of international relations is going to have a whole new set of dynamics within it. That's at a global level. Then you go to the sub-regional components in terms of the unresolved territorial disputes, the Korean Peninsula, the disputes between China and Japan, the disputes, obviously, which continue in relation to Taiwan, the South China Sea, which brings together 6 or 7 different states, the unresolved nature of the Indian-Chinese border, the unresolved state of India-Pakistan. And in that region alone, you have something like 6 of the world's nuclear weapon states as well. And Asia, for the first time in the last year, having become the largest consumer, becoming a larger consumer of defense products than Europe in aggregate. And so this is the new emerging reality. And therefore, the level of statesmanship that's going to be required in managing these sort of drivers of change is more acute now than in any period that we have faced since the formal end of the last Cold War. And a final footnote on nationalism. And this goes to those who will speak on the question of where goes the global economy and the globalization project as well. Because political nationalism is not just something which exists in a person's head, it is driven by forces, either deep, unrequited anxieties about other states, or deep, unrequited anxieties about my own lot within my own state. And so therefore what we see, for example, with the emergence of the far-right parties in Europe, but also developments not dissimilar in many other parts of the world, is a deep questioning of which Piketty is simply one articulation of the politics of inequality and the reality of inequality, but frankly, the reality of the absence of opportunity. Put all those things together, as I said at the outset, there's always a danger we talk about politics and international politics too much, but it is the mechanism and the means by which we set international structures, international frameworks for dealing with the raft of other challenges, be they environmental, social, or economic. So my overall point is, these geopolitical challenges, nationalist and international, geostrategic and geopolitical, and partly geoeconomic, are going to require the most careful handling so that they don't bring down the whole house of cards by accident.
On the point of nationalism, of course, we have noticed that in the European elections very clearly, but it's always a question of whether what we are seeing in those nationalist movements, is it a societal backlash against, to the economic realities? And as I had mentioned, Ms. Mohammed, in my introduction, we always knew that income inequality is brewing somewhere underneath, but this year it was the year where it came out to the public debate, and it's not anymore an elitist conversation. It became part of widespread debate because also the figures are scary. So why has it suddenly become part of the top agenda for 2015?
Thank you, Nadine, and congratulations on to the Forum on the Outlook report for this year. Incredible. I think we're talking about shaping a new agenda, for one. So there is a conversation out there about how do we move from an agenda that reduced poverty to one that eradicates it. And then as we go along in that conversation, reviewing what we've done over the last decade or so, it becomes very clear that it's not just about eradicating poverty, that the inequalities issue is very big on the agenda. If anything, it's probably the greatest threat that we have to the next agenda that we put together. So I think there are many factors, and I see them in the trends. Leadership is one. But from a practitioner's point of view, I would say that not having the right policies that really address the way in which we inform the plans that we have to invest in these agendas is probably one of the biggest causes for these rising inequalities, that we see economies growing, and they're growing without people or consideration for the environment. And both of those are big factors for the tensions that we see today in many of our societies. I think we do need to take a look at those, the way in which we craft policies, public policy itself in many countries, the institutional capacity to address the multidimensional aspects of it that all are around public policy is not there. And I think that we have a number of tools that are missing, the whole data issue of where you begin to even address policy and know which groups are you talking about. For us today, we clearly see that the policy choices that we have don't focus on the broad range of challenges that we have. So when we're talking about gender, age, discrimination, the rights agenda as we have it, this is all missing from what we're doing. And I think that that's really where we need to come back to that drawing board and say, you know, this is what we need to do to inform plans, and then perhaps we target better. Clearly, the redistribution of wealth is a big part of this, and how we do that at all levels. Inequality is rising not just within countries, but across countries as well, and it's global. It's a global issue that we all have to deal with. There isn't a cookie cutter for this, but it is very important that we do less also about targeting symptoms and really begin to do a lot more about the root causes of exclusion in what we're doing.
I'd like to bring in Dr. Posen to this discussion because as Ms. Mohammed said, inequality is everywhere. However, probably the reasons are different from place to place, especially the difference between the Western world and emerging economies. Doctor, do you think that in the United States, there was also the Occupy movement lately, which is also anti-globalization and capitalism? Do you think that it has become part of the debate, the issue of inequality versus the calling for globalization and capitalism? Do you think that it's taking its necessary place in the public debate? between policymakers?
I think it's very important that the outlook on the global agenda that the forum put together has identified not just inequality as one of the top issues, but the other economic issue is so-called jobless growth. And these two go together. I mean, I completely agree with Minister Rudd that in the background, geopolitics triumphs overall, but as he said, it's a question of anxiety. And I think this has been part of the problem with the inequality debate. As the Assistant Secretary General said, we need to unpack inequality and be very clear about what we mean. So we toss around income inequality, wealth inequality. Let me try to put to you what I think are the key developments. The first is actually the good news that on a human scale, fewer people are in absolute poverty in the world today than at any time in human history. This is not just China, this is Eastern Europe, this is India, this is, we hope, starting now in sub-Saharan Africa. And we have to recognize that this was absolutely impossible to disentangle from globalization. We moved 1 billion people out of actual poverty because of globalization. And it's very hard to argue on human terms that anything is as important as that. However, that doesn't satisfy the local anxieties, the nationalisms, the issues within countries. And that's the second point we have to look at. That we talk in this sort of abstract way, and even Piketty and others who are ostensibly coming at a very radical point of view talk in this abstract way. But to pick up on a term the Assistant Secretary General used, exclusion is actually a huge part of this. This is about specified minorities. We know about the people in France in the banlieue. This is about specified minorities in various parts of the world. This is about women. This is not really about some disembodied thing that inequality is just sort of this generic trend. It really is about specific groups. The third point that I would talk about is taking that as sort of one of the more negative aspects. That, as Larry Summers says in his essay in the Outlook book, which is well worth reading, obviously, about jobless growth, this is about lack of education and, more importantly, lack of demand for low-skilled young men in rich countries. And it's not, and you have a mirror image in this region, which we saw play out politically in the events of the last few years, where there's insufficient demand for high-skilled young men in this region. But in the end, what we're talking about are fundamental shifts of technology and society that mean this, precisely the type of people who are most likely to be violent or prone to nationalism or prone to unrest are the people who are being most displaced. And this is a key part of the political economy we have to address. From a more purely economic point of view, however, the news isn't as bad as you might think. Not only do we have this progress in human terms across the world, but we also have the fact that we know we can do something about income inequality. If you look at Europe, for all its failures, and their failures are myriad right now, the fact remains that these outbursts of right-wing politics, these outbursts of intolerance, have actually been relatively contained, despite enormous unemployment comparable to the 1930s. And why is this? This is in large part because there is a well-functioning welfare state in Europe. The actual post-tax income inequality is much lower. And this is, of course, where the US is so perverse. The US has extraordinary income inequality, not so much because it is that different an economy than everybody else's, it's because it does not support any redistribution or any sizable redistribution. And you can say, well, that's a political acceptance. The part that you can't easily agree to anymore is the idea that, oh, this leads to much better performance by the US. There's some sort of Dickens trade-off, that if you look more like 1870, you outgrow everybody else. The US is outgrowing people, but not by a huge amount. And so it's not like they're doing well by sacrificing inequality. One final point. I think it is very important as we look around the world that we pick up on one of the few constructive things that perhaps not the people of Davos, but the leaders of the G20 have done. We've seen two things advanced on the international economic agenda that should help. First is the push and the change in language that came out of the fall IMF World Bank meetings, a push towards infrastructure, a push towards public investment. That is a global push. That is something that is needed. There's a lot of discussion, a lot of groups within this conference that are working on aspects of that, public-private partnerships. Gordon Brown's leading a group. There's a lot going on. But I think that that is one of the places where we can all agree there's huge benefits to be had. It would employ these men. It would provide better benefits and productivity going forward. It would help with the short-term growth problem. We really have to act on that. And the final piece is to think about some of the global tax issues. The OECD has shown some real leadership on this. There's new initiatives about trying to limit tax avoidance, both corporate and personal. Again, this is not to say that everybody has to be taxed at French rates. That's not going to work. But it is to say that, well, it's not. It is to say that there is a danger to everyone when there are small, let us call them offshore places, that provide distortions and escapes from legitimate taxation. And these are two areas where I think the international economic community can move forward.
I think you touched on 2 points that I will be going back to Ms. Mohammed with, which is the issue of education and the issue of taxation, on whether these can be viable solutions for the widening gap between rich and poor. But I'd like to actually draw on the point of inclusiveness that you mentioned, Doctor, to talk about the region, the Middle East. Dr. Dashti, we have seen, we have all witnessed what has happened in the Arab world. And initially, the spark was because of non-inclusive growth. Do you agree? Or because there is a certain link that the lack of jobs, especially youth unemployment, which featured high on the outlook for Middle Eastern policymakers' agenda, that this triggered the societal backlash and the political events, but then there are also the other theories. So I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
No question, Nadeem, that the issue of inclusiveness, that the citizens of the region have seen that they're not beneficiary of this growth. And you see it in Egypt, you see it in Tunisia. The countries were growing at 8%, 9%, but the people at the masses, they're not reaping these benefits. So it was only targeted to a certain group, let alone the expectation of the future. People didn't see that their future is bleak. The opportunities, countries are not creating opportunities for a better quality of life and standard of living. And people are despair to the extent that they're impatient. There's no more patience to give governments time to do any reforms. And this is what we see in countries, the uprising that happened in Tunisia, other countries in Egypt, Libya, and other places of it. Unfortunately, we're seeing chaos that came, and managing the expectations of the people who revolted is a very big challenge now with the governments who are handling, now they're coming into power. And here we come. We are in a time where there's so many complex issues and challenges that confront our region. And we never decided to take them serious and take serious reforms, thinking that we have ample of time. And time is on our side. Unfortunately, it's not. We have our population, we have a young population. In this region, GCC, we're talking about almost 65% is under the age of 29. So you have this youth bulge, have a lot of energy, but they have a lot of expectation for a better standard of living. And if you're not, and you're educating them, at the same time, you're not reaping the benefit of the education. So we're seeing a negative return on investment on education, unfortunately, in this region. But at the same time, this is energy. There is talent, energy, and it's not been utilized. So where do you think this young kid will go? When this energy is not utilized in productive activities, and you're not creating opportunities for them.
But Dr. Dashti, we keep on talking about education, that you have an educated population, yet there are no jobs, so there seems to be a missing link there.
Yes.
So
the mismatch is very important. Now we're talking about, we moved into quantity, investment, just get people to be educated. We ended up becoming a credential societies vis-a-vis a knowledge societies. People just want to get a college degree. The content in the college degree is irrelevant to us. So you're getting societies that are credential societies. We just want to have a college degree. But real life You need to have content, knowledge, so that you can produce, you can be a person demanded for their services, productive. Now it's an issue that the region will have to, again, invest in training and vocational training and on-job training so that it becomes this pool of adults are recruitable so that the private sector can recruit them. Because now we're also coming back into the private sector and you have to play a role. And you're getting the chicken and egg. I don't have a good qualified people, and then you tell the private sector, you need to invest in them, into it. And now we're having another rise. Not only the masses and the citizens are frustrated from the regimes, but now also they're frustrated from the private sector itself. Because they're seeing now that the transformation of the wealth is going from the state, for any reforms going on, and economic reforms, is going to go from the state to a group of people called the private sector, and certain families. And they're not going to see the benefits of it. So you're going to see also a big backlash from the citizens if you're on the private sector and energizing the private sector. Unless we're going to have a very concerted policies that takes into account that we're going to energize the private sector, making sure and ensuring that the masses are beneficiary of this growth.
But private sector, by definition, looks for profitability, for the bottom line. Dr. Posen, he's giving you a sign. You have a very quick intervention because I'd like to hear Mr. Majid Jafar's view on this.
Just point, and what you said, Nadine, about the missing link, that you're not getting the right demand, even for the educated. The greatest shortfall, the way this region stands out in the world, is its lack of globalization. Its lack of integration with the world economy, its lack of investment from abroad. And my colleague at Pearson Institute, Marcus Noland, has done a bunch of studies on this, and we find that those economies in the region that are more integrated with the rest of the world are the ones who do manage to generate the jobs. So it's another piece of this globalization process that the private sectors in this region, except for obviously the energy sector, tend to be very inward-looking and not open, and that's part of the problem.
But I can disagree a little bit in this. What safeguards some countries in this region is their limited globalization when the financial crisis occurred in the world. Also, it saves the countries also.
You can be globalized like China was without being exposed to international credits. And since most of the economies in this region are net savers, that's okay.
Let's hear Mr. Jafar's view on this, especially the debate about the jobs, the youth unemployment in the Middle East, although now it's much worse than it was before the political events happening in the region.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's been listed as persistent youth unemployment, but actually it is not only the highest region worldwide with youth unemployment now getting close to 30%, and I think that's actually understated, but it's the fastest rising. But I think in terms of the role of the private sector, just looking at all the priorities that came out, the 10 key issues in the report, all of them are universal. I mean, all of them apply to every part of the world. Of course, they apply differently, but they are universal challenges. And I think all of them require a multi-stakeholder approach. There isn't a single one that can be handled by just governments or just the private sector or just, academia or international intergovernmental international organizations. They all require a multi-stakeholder approach. Now, turning to the Middle East and the issue of youth unemployment, unlike some other regions, such as Southern Europe, where it has emerged post the financial crisis, it's been a chronic problem that we've been talking about for decades and warning about in this region. But overlaid, we've had the political upheavals and the global financial and economic crisis, and now open conflict. I mean, there are some wars going on, of course, in our region. So it's gone from that chronic problem now to an acute crisis, and there's a sense of urgency that unfortunately isn't being reflected. Because the media and so on.
Because people prioritize. When you have a war ongoing, the priority becomes that instead of the underlying problem.
That, and it's actually hard to show on Al Arabiya or any TV station youth unemployment. I mean, how do you?
I think we have the biggest space for business news among all the channels in the region.
No, absolutely, but I mean, how do you present